We're entering the third week of the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, and so far there's no end of the conflict in sight. Iran's supreme leader has been killed, as well as some 3,000 other Iranians. The U.S. claims its ultimate goal is to destroy Iran's ability to project its military power beyond its borders. However, U.S. President Trump himself has repeatedly called on Iranians to topple their own government. Inside the United States, polling indicates most Americans oppose the war, and some U.S. officials have hinted that the conflict could end in a matter of weeks. But let's take a listen to what the Israel Defense Forces spokesman had to say today about Israel's war plans.
We have an orderly, well-planned combat strategy. We have thousands more targets in Iran, and we generate additional targets every day. The regime is already weakened, and we continue to weaken it more and more each day.
But despite the confidence on the side of the United States and Israel, Iran seems ready to dig in. Let's bring up the latest comments from Iran's foreign minister. He said, "This is not a war of survival. We are stable and strong enough. We're defending our people from this act of aggression. We don't see any reason why we should talk with the Americans. We were talking with them when they decided to attack us. There's no good experience talking with the Americans." Let's bring in Sara Harmouch to answer some of those questions. She's founder of H9 Defense and a defense policy researcher. Sara, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
As we just heard there seems to be no interest in peace talks in Tehran, despite the heavy strikes. What logic do you think that the regime is following?
The regime's logic is avoid appearing coerced into negotiation. It's been its entire history. Iran's always relied on deterrence and regime logic, like regime survival logic, rather than immediate battlefield victory. So Iran's strategy emphasizes absorbing punishment while preserving regime authority and deterrence credibility. Iran's military posture is entirely built around endurance and retaliation rather than conventional dominance. So entering right now during active time of escalation and after immediately heavy strikes could be interpreted domestically as a strategic weakness, and Iran does not want to communicate that and tries to avoid appearing weak or signaling any vulnerability. So Tehran tends to signal resilience, but at first, and then explore diplomacy if it believes it has restored deterrence.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, their current goal is to extend the war until the campaign is, what, too costly or too unpopular to continue? And then what? Will they be looking to negotiate a peace deal? What's the end game there?
The short answer is yes. I do think Iran is trying to extend the war. Iran knows, and its leadership, they know they cannot defeat Israel and the United States in a conventional war. So instead, they rely on increasing the political and economic cost of continuing conflict. And which is why they've also invested heavily in missiles, drones, and proxy networks, specifically to sustain prolonged pressure. So the objective is not necessarily military victory for Iran. Instead, it's Iran wants to change the political calculus of its adversaries by increasing the cost of continued operations. And we've seen them do that and focus on economic targets, whether it was striking the Gulf countries' oil refineries, gas facilities, threatening with the Strait of Hormuz. And we've seen gas prices increase. We've seen oil prices increase. So Iran seems to be focused on targeting the economic and the luxury land and locations in the Gulf in order to increase the cost of this war and focus on war of attrition and strategies of attrition and cost imposition in order to pressure the U.S. and pressure Israel to halt the war.
Now, as we heard there just a moment ago, Iran's foreign minister says this isn't a war of survival. But would you agree with that?
I wouldn't agree with that. Iran does great at strategic messaging. It does not always communicate what is actually happening, and it will never say publicly that it is a war of survival or it's losing or it's weak, because then that would weaken its domestic narrative of strength. So publicly acknowledging a war of survival would signal vulnerability and potentially weaken the regime's domestic, narrative of strength. And also, Iranians have long framed conflicts as defensive but manageable confrontation. They would not want to frame it ever as an existential struggle. And that messaging serves two purposes. Domestically, it assures the people that the state remains stable and strong. And internationally, it communicates that communiques that it's ready to escalate, but this escalation could still be controlled.
Now, let's turn our eyes to the domestic front in Iran. Before the war, we saw the government put down popular protests against the regime with deadly efficiency, killing thousands. How tight is the government's grip on power inside the country?
Despite the strikes and the leadership targeting and the death of Ali Khamenei and the no appearance of Mujtaba Khamenei, who the new supreme leader, the Iran state retains significant coercive capacity. Iran's security apparatus includes the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the besieged militias, which are entrenched and remain deeply entrenched in the political system. So while the public dissatisfaction is real, the regime still maintains strong internal security institutions capable of suppressing unrest.
Now, if the current trajectory continues, do you see this conflict being over in a matter of weeks, like some officials have indicated? Or do you think we're looking at a much larger conflict, a longer conflict, rather?
That is uncertain. This war has many actors and it has many different variations of what could happen. We've seen Iran strikes on the Gulf countries. The Gulf countries have been restrained. Whether they decide to strike back and retaliate, that would definitely expand the war. We've also seen the front in Lebanon with Hezbollah open, and we've seen the war expand there. We have not seen it expand yet in Yemen with the Houthis. However, statements of Houthi officials last week have stated that they are ready to fight militarily if Iran wants them to join. So there are different actors to consider, and also what does the U.S. want? What does Israel want? There seems to be a little gap between what each want. President Trump does not seem to necessarily care about regime change, where Israel does care about regime change. So it's very uncertain. And also, we've seen missile exchanges and limited strikes, which those can continue for weeks and months because they do not require large troop deployments. But the sustainability of the conflict also depends on munition stockpiles, political tolerance for risk, and international pressure. And in many regional conflicts, wars end not because one side wins decisively, but because the cost of escalation becomes unacceptable. So it will depend on all of these factors, and then how long can Iran impose cost, and how long are other actors willing to tolerate it, and when do they stop?
So do you see any possible diplomatic off-ramp at this hour?
Diplomacy right now, especially during times of active escalation, is difficult, but it's not impossible. We've seen them happen before. There could be indirect mediation talks via Qatar or Oman. We've seen this before happen, where they've facilitated communication between the U.S. and Iran. There also, during war times, there are back-channel diplomacy, which could also happen. Or there could also be another scenario of a mutual de-escalation formula, where all sides start to de-escalate strikes without formally acknowledging a ceasefire. So it really does depend, but most conflicts in the region eventually de-escalate through back-channel and quiet diplomacy rather than public negotiations.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. That was Sara Harmouch, defense policy researcher and founder of H9 Defense. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And let's take a look now outside of Iran's borders with Mehrzad Boroujerdi. He's an expert on Iran and Middle Eastern politics at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Mehrzad, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So the U.S. and Israel want to limit Iran's military power beyond its borders, yet we're seeing them attack targets throughout the region and choking off international energy supplies. So the question is, who's coming out ahead?
Well, we are at the start of week 3, and I think the initial shock that the Iranians absorbed has worn off. And we are seeing that Iran is able to manage significant retaliatory salvos. More importantly, they have managed to close down the Strait of Hormuz, which is causing a lot of headaches and heartburns in global markets. On the other hand, of course, Iran is no match for the combined power of Israel and the United States militarily, speaking. And I think now they have total control over Iranian airspace. What happened a couple of days ago was important in the sense that the U.S. attacked the Khark Island. which is really the single most important physical asset in Iran's oil industry. Some 95% of Iran's crude oil exports are loaded from that island alone. Therefore, any talk about hitting it again or perhaps even occupying it by sending ground forces can be an important event in terms of how this conflict is evolving.
Now, you were just talking about the Strait of Hormuz there, and Donald Trump has called on his allies to help escort oil tankers through the strait, but so far he hasn't gotten many pledges of support. Does that surprise you?
It does surprise me, but also keep in mind that just a few days ago, President Trump was saying that U.S. ships, naval ships, will be able to escort, and we can provide insurance, etc. So we don't need anyone. But now, we see a change of position on his part. Meanwhile, some of the countries that he has appealed to, I don't think they are going to heed his advice. So, for example, I don't expect China to be sending naval ships, or a country like India that gets a lot of oil from Iran is making its own deals with Iran about passage of ships that are heading to India. So I don't expect too many states to join. Perhaps the British and the French might reluctantly join this effort, but we have to wait and see whether they might be shy about doing this publicly.
Now, Iran has a number of proxies in the region. Could you help us understand who they are and how they could affect this conflict more broadly?
Yes, there are four important proxies that Iran has. Of course, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and the Hashd al-Shaabi, which is the Shiite group in Iraq. I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that despite years of trying to disarm, weaken these non-state actors by the Americans, by the Israelis, as of right now, none of them has been disarmed, right? Therefore, Iran can still count on their support. Hezbollah has already been able to fire missiles at Israel, and the Houthis have not yet been really active in this conflict. I have no doubt that perhaps the Iranians are going to encourage the Houthis to join them and, start firing missiles in the Persian Gulf if, the Americans really decide to escalate the conflict in terms of takeover of the Strait of Hormuz.
So that sounds like if the conflict continues to drag out, we could see it spill over into a wider regional conflict.
Absolutely. I think that's part of Iran's strategy. You see, they realize that they do not have the military might to challenge Israel and the United States. Therefore, the only ace that they have in their hand is really to exert economic pressure on United States and its allies. And by targeting 11 of their neighboring states in the Persian Gulf region, they are basically escalating the price of oil, causing a mischief in terms of, the stock market and so forth. And I think that's their strategy to try to bring this war to an early end, knowing that there are too many folks who are going to be negatively impacted due to this economic pressure. So in a way, this is really, at this point, in my view, a contest between military might on the one hand and economic pressure on the other, and we see who is going to blink first.
All right. Now, the U.S. has rejected Oman and Egypt's efforts to mediate so far. Do other countries in the region have any leverage to help end the conflict sooner?
Well, I think those are two of the important ones, particularly the Omanis, who have played host a number of times to, in terms of the negotiations that were taking place between Iran and the U.S. Regarding nuclear issues. Turkey might be another state, both a good neighbor of Iran and also a member of NATO, that has offered its services in terms of trying to mediate this conflict. But you see, I think as of right now, there does not seem to be any serious political will either in Tel Aviv or in Washington or in Tehran to really, bring this war to an end. I expect that this war might go on for a few more weeks before we see serious negotiations and therefore enabling a mediator to play the role of interlocutor and try to bring this war to an end.
All right, that was Mehrzad Boroujerdi from the Missouri University of Science and Technology. Many thanks helping us find our way through this complex issue.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to have to leave it there, but please comment below. We do read them, and we'll try to answer your questions in future videos. And if you'd like to see more from us, don't forget to like and subscribe.